Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well. I know you got to read about the Black Death in your textbook yesterday and make an outline about it. And I know some of you have written your research papers on this topic, so you may already know some of what we're going to discuss. But I'm going to open with my slides. We're going to share screen. And that's here. I'm going to open with a nursery rhyme, which I believe you probably grew up playing a game too. A ring around a rosy, a pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. Now, the legend behind this nursery rhyme is that it's based and that it originated from the Middle Ages during the bubonic plague. If this is true, the theory stands that a ring around a rosy would refer to the infected people. They would have a rash on their arms and neck that would have a red ring around it and a dark centered spot that looked like a rose because it was kind of puckered and wrinkled. They would get a high fever, become unconscious, and probably finally die. A pocket full of posies. People carried flowers, often posies, to cover the smell of the dead and dying. And also, many of them believed, and some of us still believe, that plants carry antibacterial properties and might actually help keep you from getting sick. So people with posies with rings around them, pockets full of medicinal herbs or flowers that would mask the smell of the dead and dying. Ashes, ashes. People would burn down the houses of an entire village that had been infected. So if you can imagine, you know how much smoke one little campfire makes. Imagine burning down an entire village, sometimes with people locked in the houses, fields being burned down, crops. The sky would be full of ashes. And this happened routinely in this case. And the final line, we all fall down, the plague filled villages and cities alike with dead and dying victims. People would collapse in the streets and people would be afraid to touch them, to bury them, and they would just stay there. And then the villages would be abandoned. So this fun game actually has a kind of horrific background, and it's kind of sad to think about. All right, moving on. We're going to talk about the bubonic plague. There are a lot of symptoms for it, and actually during this period of time, during the Black Death plague outbreak, there were actually 3 different kinds of plague. All of them were caused by the same bacteria. We'll talk about that in a second, but they all presented with very similar symptoms. The common symptoms between all 3 versions of the plague were fever, limb pain, delirium, which is seeing things when you have a high fever, difficulty breathing, vomiting, and seizures. All of these things are caused by high fevers. Deep and painful coughs, passing of blood, and going into a coma. And then in the end, you would end up having true black spots as parts of your body died. The bubonic plague specifically had manifested itself in the nodes, in your lymph nodes, in your glands. So this common bacteria spread by fleas, which you all have learned now, fleas that fed on rodents, specifically the black rats and brown rats that came over on the trade ships. But that then spread to all of the common mammals that lived in crops and fields around them. So the rats and cats would have these fleas that would then hop into a person and bite them and cause these welts that would look like red rings around a black rose. So that's bubonic. It infected your lymph nodes. And you have glands all over your body. And I don't know if you've studied this in your human body study yet. I think you probably have. All of those would become infected, and then that spreads to the rest of your body. Now, there are 2 other ways for that infection to spread, that bacteria to spread to your body, and that is pneumonic plague, which means it has infected your lungs. Pneumonic plague could develop from the bubonic plague because your lymph nodes are your filters for your body, so that could, if those are getting infected, then your lungs can. But sometimes they would skip that stage. Sometimes a person would just develop pneumonic plague. Somehow it got directly into their lungs. They inhaled those droplets, and they died much more quickly. Another presentation of the plague was septicemic, which means it's an infection in your bloodstream. Sometimes the bite from the flea would just go directly to your bloodstream, never affected your lymph nodes, or infected bloodstream first and then your lymph nodes. And that's a much less common form of it, but that happened also. So there were 3 actual versions of the Black Death. Bubonic plague was just the most common and most quickly spread because it was from fleas that would hop from animal to animal and house to house and person to person. Pneumonic plague could only be caught if droplets were directly spread to you, kind of like the coronavirus today. So hold on a second while I find my notes here. So the miasma theory, the people of the time really believed that, well, they didn't understand infection. They didn't understand bacterial spread. They didn't understand cleanliness. They believed that there's this miasma. There was just like this cloud of polluted air around them that if they went outside or they went into a group of people, they were going to breathe in this pollution. And it was kind of like this unknown fog surrounding them. They really were clueless as to the cause. And that was one reason why they would carry those flowers with them. So we call that the miasma theory. And that continued for many years. And some people still honestly treat infections or unknown sicknesses this way. Even in the case of what we're going through right now, I know people who are afraid to just go outside into their yards because they think there's this unknown cloud of illness that they might contract. So imagine how fearful that would be, how scared you would be to go out into public, not knowing what's causing this horrible thing that's taking over your town or your village or your city. Huge amounts of population were dying in the streets, and there was no one to bury them. Entire villages would just disappear. Nobody was left. I've recommended a book on your lesson plans. It's not required. If you get it, it's on Audible. You can get paperback really easily. It really shows in a simple way just the effect on day-to-day life that trying to just get through the countryside would be almost impossible. You'd just come upon empty village after empty village with nothing there. They had ghost towns. So the spread of this first wave of Black Death, is when we're looking at the mid-1300s, was very quick. I mean, and the only reason that was able to spread this quickly is because of those Mongols that we've been studying. If you remember that they opened up those Silk Roads, they got everything going again and trade routes established, both land and sea. They were also traveling and conquering, and one of their means of spreading it was to threaten the cities they were besieging by throwing infected bodies over the walls. It's really a horrible thing. So I'm just going to show you the rapid spread of the Black Death here. So we have those sections. I'm going to back this up, and maybe I can't. It started over here very lightly and then rapidly spread, and you see Constantinople down here. So we have where the Mongols are in the south of Russia, going into Asia Minor, and the trade routes. So we have where they're trading, where their ships are sailing, port cities, Constantinople, all along these coastlines into Greece. And then everywhere the ships touch, into Italy and Cathay and Genoa. And then it starts spreading across the land routes of trade into Spain and France and England, and then back into the mainland. Just within 2 years, it's everywhere. Just wiping out huge. I think at the end of this wave of bubonic plague, I believe the estimate is about 30 million people, 25 to 30 million. And this is just the first wave. Between 1300 and 1600, there were mid-1300s, mid-1600s. There were about 30 small waves of the plague, but there were 3 main big ones. Each successive wave took fewer lives because of built-in immunity, and people learned how to handle it. They finally were starting to realize what was spreading it. But over 300 years, Europe completely changes because of this. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. So in light of what we're looking at today, what we're living through, what we're seeing, we're also hiding in our houses. One of my favorite textbooks that I've been using to refer to for further reading and further activities for you all over this year is a Biblioplan. And there's a whole section in here on the effect that the bubonic plague had on medieval society. And I'm just going to read some of this out loud to you, and I want you to think about if this sounds familiar. In addition to its physical symptoms, plague caused sad psychological symptoms wherever it struck. Since no one knew which of his neighbors might be carrying the disease, no one knew whom to trust. Neighbor turned against neighbor, brother against brother, husband against wife, and mother against child. Some doctors refused to treat plague victims for fear that they themselves might catch it. For the same reason, some priests closed their churches and refused to give dying plague victims their last rites. Some desperate families bought enough grain to tide them over until the plague had run its course, and then they barred themselves inside their homes, isolating themselves, not knowing that when they brought their grain into their homes, they brought the plague bacteria along with it. Today we see our churches closed, not because our priests and our pastors are afraid, but because we've realized that that's part of how we stop the spread. We see hospitals not letting loved ones visit people who are ill. We see people hoarding goods and hiding in their homes and not leaving them. Now, we're probably not bringing the plague into our house by bringing in our groceries, but we do wipe our groceries off and sterilize things. We're very much in a similar setting, but we have modern medicine. We have doctors and scientists who are working quickly to fix our problem. So imagine the setting that we're in without the knowledge and the hope that we have. And that would be a very scary place to be in. So on that note, many of the medieval treatments are comical to us. Some of them may have had some effect, but most of them wouldn't. This is a very small list of possible treatments that could have been recommended. Some of them are bathing victims in vinegar and urine, bloodletting using knives or leeches, lancing those buboes, those blisters on the glands, and then layering them with butter, onion, and garlic to draw out the infection. Now, onion and garlic have antibacterial properties. We don't know what that might have done, but that doesn't sound like a good idea. Using toads to draw out the infection. I couldn't really find a whole lot of further information about this. I know I've read this before, and there's also they would put live chickens against the buboes. I can't really find anything behind why they thought that would help, but toads were kind of had this mystical power over the medieval age, and I'm not really sure what they thought was going to happen there. They treated the plague like a poison, and they would attempt to self-vaccinate themselves by scraping the bubo sites and using small doses of that gangrene to try to inject themselves with it and get it out of their system or cause their system just to fight it off. I can't imagine that ended well either. They would kill all dogs and cats roaming the villages. Now, here is where they may have been beginning to realize that rodents and small mammals were carrying and helping spread this. However, what happened when they killed the dogs and cats is what eats mice and rats is dogs and cats. So when you kill all the dogs and cats, rats roam freely. There's no predator cycle. So they actually caused the problem to be worse by doing that. They would burn houses and villages that were believed to be infected to keep the spread from progressing. Sometimes they'd just pray over the sick person and anoint them with holy oil. The church called for repentance, but because the Catholic Church at this point in time is becoming works-oriented, repentance is shown by flagellation, and you read this in your chapter yesterday. They would whip themselves till they bled to show that they were repentant rather than through prayer and changing of actions. There was also a huge group of people that believed the Jews, because some of them seemed to have some immunity, and many by their clean lifestyle would not get sick. They thought that the Jews were possibly causing this through some form of witchcraft, and they would exile the Jews from their community or execute them. During the second wave of plague, I believe in the 1400s, early 1500s, as many as I think 18,000 Jews were killed in one location just because it was assumed that they were the ones guilty of spreading this. Now, like I said before, there were those three main waves of the plague, 1300s through the 1600s. By the time the plague had been around 300 years, people were learning how to deal with it. They were realizing that you can protect yourself from contamination. They didn't have hospital masks. They didn't have the N95 mask that everybody's dependent on these days. They didn't have hospital gloves that you could throw away when you come home from the store. They didn't have doctor's gowns that could be rolled up and tossed or burned. But they still had doctors, and they still had healers who wanted to help people. And by the time that last wave of the plague came through in the 1600s, doctors had developed a pretty consistent form of protection. Now, some of these would have been used, a mask of sorts with the beak was used in the 1300s in that first wave. But when you hear about the plague doctors and you see those costumes, that wasn't fully developed until that very last wave of plague. However, it helps to see what these people were dealing with. We're still looking at the need for protection. And in that beak, in that mask that you're looking at here, they would pack it with flowers, with herbs that they believed would, it wasn't just to ward off the stench, but they really believed that it would filter and clean the air and protect them from, build their immunity. The leather cloak they thought would protect them from infection, and it probably did if they cleaned it well between stations before touching their bodies. They wore gloves, and they would carry a wand or a big stick to keep people away from them so that they wouldn't have to touch anyone. You stay over there, don't come near me. And they would have glass eyes in those masks. Sometimes they'd be red glass, and I believe there was something behind that. And they thought the red was a filter also, but pretty creepy. I can imagine having this be my doctor coming to take care of me. Another interesting thing I came across, this was, again, this happened in the later waves of the plague, but it relates to us today, and I think it's fascinating. A lot of us are doing contactless restaurant delivery. We'll, order Domino's and they leave it on our porch and we pay over our phones. We're trying not to handle cash, and we're paying using PayPal and Venmo because coins are dirty, cash is dirty, and we're trying not to spread those germs right now. Well, as they began to realize in the Middle Ages that these things could be carried through contact, they began to clean themselves. They wore protective masks, and when they needed to trade, they still had markets. They still needed food. They still needed to trade money and barter, but they knew those things were dirty, so they would form these centers in the middle of their markets. And they would have a stone that was hollowed out in the middle that would be filled with vinegar. So the person who needed supplies would go to that stone and leave their list and put their coins in that well of vinegar so they'd be disinfected and sanitized. And then they'd go back off to a safe distance. The merchant would then come up and see the list, leave his goods there in the vinegar or next to the vinegar, take his money and go. So they would have a very sanitary exchange of goods. Now, if you remember, we just studied feudalism. We've been talking about it over the entire last 2 semesters, that hierarchy that was established when the Normans came and took over England. We had a king, we had lords and vassals to the king, we had knights who served the lords, and we had the peasants and serfs who served the knights. But it all was a cycle, it all came back around. It was an interdependence. Well, now the population has drastically decreased, and there aren't enough people. We don't have enough servants and peasants to work the land. We don't have enough knights to protect the lords. There aren't enough lords to serve the king or make decisions. And so we had villages lying empty. If they weren't burned, then there was nobody living in them. And all of those fields and crops were lying, rotting on the ground. There wasn't anybody to even harvest the crops. So you had a really successful grain crop, but your village dies and there's 2 of you left. You can't harvest all of it. It's just going to rot. So that in turn created famine. So one of the side effects of the Black Plague was famine over and over and over because there's not enough people to work. So what happened to the feudal system? You saw knights going out and working with their hands, planting fields. You saw peasants, men who had only farmed land or never been given a chance to do something more, being able to rise up and start a business, to take over land that's just lying empty and nobody's doing anything with it. They began to have property rights. They began to say, I can take care of this. And the knights had to let them, the lords had to let them. They ended up having to create the more common ground and common work ethic. Women even gained rights. There weren't enough men to own land or work the land. Women had property for the first time, clear and free. Their husbands would die and it would still be their land because somebody had to take care of it. So it was devastating and the famines were hard. But there was also a man named John Ball. He led a peasants' revolt right after the end of the plague of the 1300s wave. And he led thousands of peasants to speak to the lords and the king and say, we got to take care of this. This is our land. These are our rights. And he was fairly unsuccessful, but he began common people realizing that they had more potential, that they weren't stuck in this cycle. the cycle had worked to an extent, but it was outdated now. It just couldn't work with the way, with the population and the way things were in this new world. So we see the feudal system falling, a middle class, which is people who can work, who are smart, who are successful. They're not rich lords and millionaires, but they're getting the job done, and they're still accountable to the king. They're still accountable to somebody. They're still paying their taxes, but they have personal property and a right to succeed. So that's about all I have for you today. Hopefully you've got enough to work with between this and your video and your outline to make a nice KWO for your next test. Make it now, don't make it later. Keep it in your binder where you know where it is and don't lose it. Label it, and we'll be using it soon, and I'll see you guys on Thursday.